For a long time, I've wondered how the American gem cutting technique came about and what made it so different than the techniques that we find being used for gem cutting in the rest of the world. So today I'm going to be looking at some primary sources and recounting the history of the American gem cutting technique on the gem cutter's craft. So if we look at the technique of American cutters today, there's a few things that we usually see being done that we almost never see being done in other parts of the world. This has baffled me for years and years, and I've been wondering, how did this happen? How did this technique of gem cutting come about in America? And how did it evolve from what I assume was its origins in Europe? So to sum up a few of the things that really, I think, define American gem cutting in the 21st century, actually there's quite a few, and pardon me if I'm overgeneralizing. Of course there's many gem cutters in America, not everyone cuts the same, but there are some things that I typically see over and over again when I see people posting their progress photos online or just asking different questions in some of the faceting groups. So I think some of the general things that we can say about American gem cutting, they're usually cutting pavilion first, crown second. Because they're cutting crown second, their final step's going to be the table. Almost always the last step's going to be the table, partially because of the need of the tabling adapter. So that's one thing, the sequence, the order, and the table. The other thing that I see a lot in American gem cutting is a lack of the preforming step. So many times people are just taking their rough stone and putting it on the dop and just beginning faceting from there with all the rough skin, which is something that I've never seen in any other country that I've been to when doing my faceting history research. So I wanted to look at some of the documentary sources that we have, and it turns out that we have quite a bit, and we can kind of see where did the story of American gem cutting start and how did it progress through the decades and eventually until it comes to where it is today. So the obvious first place that we pretty much must always start when talking about American gem cutting is J. Harry Howard and the Handbook for Amateur Lapidary. As far as faceting goes, you are going to be hard pressed to find a source from America before 1935 other than a few small articles. This is really the first time that we have like a set of instructions. One of the cool things about this series of books is they almost all have instructions for the same stone, which is America's favorite cut, the standard round brilliant. We have to remember what era we're in, 1935. This is really the beginning of the American faceting story. We don't have a tradition of masked machines at this point. The masked machine is still very new. It's still coming into common usage, and so the way people use it are going to be varied and different. So in the Handbook for Amateur Lapidary, here are the instructions that Howard gives us for how we should cut a stone. So he starts with preforming the table and the crown bevel, and then flipping the stone on the dop and preforming the pavilion angle to a point. Then he's going to redop the stone on the crown side, cut and polish the table. Then he's going to flip the stone and redop it again so that the polished table is flat against the dop, using shellac and a jig to maintain straightness. So he's already flipped the stone on the dop like 4 times now before we've even started really to cut any facets. So he's going to start with the pavilion facet, so bottom first. 41 degrees, 600 grit lap. He starts with 4-sided pyramid, then he cuts the corners, so he's making 8 mains. Then he's changing 5 degrees and cutting the break facets on 16 indexes. He tells us it's impossible to place them correctly without some sort of cheater, but his handpiece homemade device doesn't have a cheater, so he literally just has to twist his dop inside of his 16 index gear in order to put these facets on there, because his index gear doesn't have enough teeth to actually cut all of the facets that he needs to cut, because the 16 index is just not enough for a brilliant cut. So we're in very archaic technology here. So next he says we're going to remove the stone from the dop, clean it, flip it over, put the pavilion into the wax and press the table against a jig to make sure it's dopped straight. So we're not using a transfer block here, it's just sort of a straightening jig. Then he's going to cut his crown mains at 45 degrees, all 8 of them. He's going to adjust by 15 degrees and cut the star facets. Then he's going to go 5 degrees under the main facets and cut the break facets. Then he's going to switch his laps. He's going to polish the crown in reverse order. Finally, he's finished, and he has a 1932 round brilliant. That was a lot of steps. A little bit overkill, I think, a little too much transferring, but I guess he really wanted to make sure. So this is where it all begins. Simple technology, not quite good enough to do what we are dreaming of doing, and a little bit overcomplicated. So let's see where we go next. We've got about 8 years later. This is The Art of Gem Cutting Complete by Fred S. Young. This is 1942. So Fred S. Young was one of the writers for Mineralogist magazine. So lots of stuff that we find in this book comes from the chapters and articles of the Mineralogist magazine. So let's see what he says 10 years later almost, versus what J. Harry Howard told us. So he tells us we're going to preform the rough by skilled fingers. So we're just going to preform the stone by hand, first things first. The rough blank is then cemented on the dop. We're going to cut and polish the table with, he tells us, a 10% oversize with the table adapter. So we're going to make it a little bit bigger than we need to so that when we cut in the rest of the facets, it's not going to be too small. We're going to cut the 8 crown mains. So he's doing crown first, which is different than what J. Harry Howard just told us. 16 girdle facets, then 8 star facets. He's then going to wash the stone, polish it. Then he tells us we're going to take it off the dop, flip it, re-dop it. We're going to cut the pavilion mains, then we're going to cut the break facets. Totally different in the way that he has decided that he wants to do mains first. So we're going to see this as we go on. For a good long while, there's not a unified way that American cutters are cutting. We have a variation right now of whether we're going to be cutting crown first or pavilion first, but now we're using a table adapter. So that's one new thing. So this is the first divergence, if we can, from the cutting style of other cultures. Our next journey through time is going to stop in 1953. We've got this small pamphlet by Dan O'Brien called How to Cut Gems. So Dan O'Brien was a machine manufacturer. He made the O'Brien machine, which is basically like an 8-sided, very, very simple handpiece. But in the book, it also gives us directions on how to use this newfangled faceting mast head. He shows pictures of the MDR and a few other ones, so he tells us how he thinks that we should be cutting a stone. So first things first, preforming. First, we're going to saw away the bad parts. So he's not even starting with a rough grit lap. He's actually starting with the saw, cutting off any bad parts. Then we're going to preform the shape on a 220 grit wheel, and he's going to grind a flat spot for the table. If it's a round stone, which it is, because we're talking about round brilliants for this video, he's going to dop the stone onto the flat table, so flat to flat. Then he's going to take his dop and either, he says, using the hands or putting it into a drill, he's going to spin the perfect round girdle, and he's going to spin the perfect cone at 45 degrees on his drill somehow, and then he now has the perfect preform. He's going to take his dop, put it into the faceting head, and start cutting the facets. So he's going to start with, well, we're on the pavilion side, so we're starting with the pavilion mains, 41 to 43 degrees. Then he's going to cut the break facets 2 to 4 degrees lower. When the facets are balanced, he's going to begin the polishing, following the same routine as cutting. He's going to flip the stone upside down, start on the crown. He starts with the mains, then goes to the stars, then goes to the break facets, making the meet points meet at the girdle and the stars. Then he puts his dop into the 45 degree table cutter. He sets his mast to 45 degrees. He comes down, he cuts the perfect table, meeting perfectly with the stars. He polishes the table, and then he does the final step of polishing his girdle. He says, on a cabochon sander and polisher. Okay, next stop in our journey is going to be Gemcraft. This is 1955. This is Leland Quick. So Leland Quick was the editor of Lapidary Journal, so he was very, very involved with the lapidary community, and I'm sure he had probably heard every technique of gem cutting that there was at the time, because he was getting all the letters and everything from all the different readers. So he's also probably a really good source of what was going on in America in 1959. I'll make a side note as I'm reading this. What he tells us in here pretty much perfectly matches what Sinkankas tells us in his lapidary manual. So I'm not going to talk about what Sinkankas says, because it's really just the same as what Quick is telling us. So Sinkankas, that's 1955, so it's pretty much the same couple of years as Quick. So let's look inside and see what Leland Quick says about gem cutting in 1959. So he tells us, first step, we're going to be doing preforming. We're going to preform to 70% depth compared to the width. So he's giving us some very precise instructions about how the preform should be sized. We're going to dop the stone. We're going to cut the girdle by free spinning it at 90 degrees. We're going to cut and polish the table. Then we're going to dop table to dop, just as we've done in pretty much every other one so far. And we're going to start with the pavilion. 8 pavilion mains, 16 girdle break facets. We're going to flip the stone upside down, and he tells us, make sure that you align your index so that your crown and pavilion facets are going to line up. He's going to cut his 8 mains, then he's going to cut his 8 girdle facets, then he's going to cut his star facets. Finally, he's going to remove it from the dop and clean the stone. So my next stop in time was 1962. This is the Facet Cutter's Handbook. This probably is one of the most popular ways that gem cutting instructions have been disseminated across America, mostly because this was really, really cheap. You see these coming with almost every used fastening machine on eBay today, which makes me believe that probably everyone had this book. So this one is an important one as well, which is why I wanted to use this one. That's Edward Sukup. So Sukup tells us he's going to cut crown first, pavilion second, because it's easier for new cutters to get their proportions correct. 1/3 on top, 2/3 on bottom, which is kind of the standard American brilliant style. 1/3 and 2/3. So he tells us you can preform, it saves time, but it's not absolutely necessary. So this is the first time that we've heard maybe you don't have to preform. So 1962, we're starting to maybe transition our ideas a little bit. So we're going to dop the stone on the pavilion side so that you can cut crown first. So again, we're seeing not every cutter is agreeing on crown first or pavilion first. So he says, round the stone, you're going to put it on 90 degrees, unlock the index, spin. First, you're going to do that on 400 grit, then you're going to do it on 1200 grit. Then we're going to cut and polish the table using a table adapter. He tells us the table at this point should be 75% of the width of the stone so that we've got plenty of room to work with it. So his preform is done. He's got a cut and polish table. Now he's ready to cut his main facet. So he says 8 mains at 45 degrees. So the table now has become a 60% table. Cut the star facets at 30 degrees, which reduces the table to 50%. Cut the break facets, 47 degrees, plus 3 from the main. So we're actually getting really into specific indexes here. So next he says, transfer using the method for your machine. So obviously at this point it's 1962, we have a lot of machines. 1940s, 1950s, we had like 10 machines, and many people were still homemaking a lot. By 1962, a lot of the machines that we have today already exist. So there's a lot of different ways to transfer the stone. Then we're going to cut the pavilion mains on 41, the pavilion breaks on 43, and then the girdle is polished at the end of the stone by putting the angle on 90 and free spinning. So not too different than what everyone else has done. Okay, next we've got comprehensive faceting. This is 1968. This is written by Douglas Hoffman, who at the time was making prismatic machines, later on went to make polymetric. So Douglas Hoffman, another, I would say, heavyweight in the world of American gem cutting and the story of American gem cutting. He has probably what I would say the first kind of modern instructions in 1968. He's going to cut the girdle. And this is interesting because this is the first time anyone has said this. He says, the symmetry of the girdle can be controlled best when it is faceted using the same index as that used for the crown break facets. So basically, whatever you have as break facets in your design, you can actually facet the girdle on those numbers and you'll control the shape and the size of the girdle. This is the first time we've ever heard this in the story of American fasting. So this is interesting. But he said, after the girdle has been cut like this to its desired width, the points between each of the facets are then rounded one into the other by setting the dop arm for freewheeling. So he's faceting the girdle, making his perfect straight girdle. Everything's exactly the same width, but then he's going to round it off anyway. So he's not keeping a faceted girdle, he's rounding it. Some people today still cut this way, faceting the girdle and then rounding it off to make it actually pure, round, brilliant stone. So that's interesting. It's the first time we've seen this. Put the dop into the 45-degree table adapter, cut, polish the table. So he's going to do 100 grit, 1200 grit, and then polish. So he's now got a faceted and then rounded girdle, and then a cut and polished table on his preform. He's already dopped it for the crown, so he's going to cut the crown. Mains first, star facets on 1200 grit, break facets on 1200 grit. He's going to transfer with a transfer block. Then he's going to cut the pavilion mains, 100 grit, then 1200 grit. Then he's going to cut the pavilion break facets, same thing, 1200 grit. Stone's finished. This has been Justin K. Prim with the Gem Cutters Craft, and I will see you guys all next time.